You know, one thing that was definitely different about this weekend's big day of protest against Trump is that this time the protests got a lot of mainstream media coverage. I don't know if the protests a couple of weeks ago were like a surprise to the headline writers and newsrooms of America's major news outlets, but for whatever reason, a couple of weeks ago, that huge day of protest was really kind of played down or just underplayed somehow in the mainstream press. That definitely turned around for the protest this weekend. Headline, New York Times, shame. Protesters nationwide rally again to condemn Trump policies. Thousands of demonstrators rallied at hundreds of events on Saturday to speak out against the president's handling of immigration, civil liberties, job cuts, and many other issues. The Times front-page protest photos and protest signs like these ones, for sale, democracy, and resist, if not now, when, and arrest the kidnappers. Headline, Washington Post, 50-51 protests rally small towns and big cities against Trump policies. Protesters gathered in hundreds of rallies across the country to denounce President Donald Trump. Washington Post and its coverage front-paged a big crowd in Washington, D.C. at the Washington Monument, including this sign front and center, innocent until proven guilty. Headline, the Associated Press, anti-Trump protesters rally in New York, Washington, and elsewhere across the country. Elsewhere is doing a lot of work in that headline, given how many protests there were. But the AP front page, this big banner outside the White House fence, Trump must go now. Next to a sign that says Free Kilmar, for Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Headline, USA Today, nationwide hands-off 50-51 protests against Trump continue for second weekend. They front-paged this upside-down American flag in the foreground, hanging, of course, in a way to signify distress. And then you can see the signs there, no king, and impeach, remove, imprison. Headline, CNN, protesters denounce Trump administration in nationwide rallies while supporting impacted communities. Here's the Boston Globe. No kings. Anti-Trump demonstrations around Boston invoke American Revolution. Here's the BBC. Thousands join anti-Trump protests across U.S. Front paging. This is a good sign. I've only ever seen this once. Don't piratize Social Security. That's very well done. Here's The Guardian, which is also based in Britain. Protesters filled the streets in cities across the U.S. to denounce Trump agenda. Here's Reuters, the news service. Thousands of protesters rally against Trump across the United States. Here's Bloomberg. Anti-Trump protesters turn out from New York City to San Francisco, and may I suggest, everywhere in between. Here's CBS News. Anti-Trump rallies held across the U.S. to protest administration's policies. Here's NPR. Protesters unite against Trump in hundreds of rallies across the U.S. No more tariffs on the sign there. Here's the L.A. Times. Anti-Trump protesters rally again in cities across the country. Impeach and remove being spelled out in bodies on the beach on the front page of the L.A. Times. This was the lead story on NBC Nightly News on Saturday night. You see the chyron there at the bottom, massive anti-Trump protests across the country.
Tonight, protests across the country, from Denver to Midtown Manhattan, to right outside the White House, people voicing anger at the Trump administration, including over its recent immigration actions.
I don't know if the mainstream media catching up now to what's been going on in the streets, I don't know if it's a big advance for that movement against Trump or not. But it's at least worth noting that it is starting to happen. It really hadn't been happening before, and it is now. The coverage is now there. That said, judging from the literally hundreds of protest videos and images that we reviewed over the weekend and compiled, my sense is that the momentum is here, and these protests are going to keep happening basically everywhere, regardless of the level of coverage they get, even though they are now getting more coverage. These are hard to put together, but we've done it. Okay, from left to right and then top to bottom, what you're looking at here is, ready? Anti-Trump protests this weekend in Chicago, Minneapolis, Anchorage. There was a whole bunch of protests in Alaska this weekend. We'll talk about that in a second, but that's Anchorage, third from the left in the middle there on the top row. Then Jacksonville, Florida, Buffalo, New York, Atlanta, Philly, Portland, Oregon, Little Rock, Arkansas, Omaha, of course, New York City, massive crowds in New York City, Denver, Houston, Washington, D.C., Cleveland, Ohio, Salt Lake City, Boise, Idaho, Hartford, Connecticut, and then the last two there are Indianapolis and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I paused there on Anchorage because they really did have a very big crowd in Anchorage this weekend. Thousands of people turned out in Anchorage. And you see some of the signs there are quite good. Due process is a right, not a privilege. There's a big one there up on the right that just says, nope. This is a very good one, actually. It's the only time I've seen this exact phrasing. Only caring about your own rights is exactly how you lose them. That's very good. Orange sign just to the right of that. Nixon and McCarthy weren't this bad. I agree. You may also see another one on the left there that's specific to where this is. Dan and Nick stand up for the rule of law. That's about Republican Senator Dan Sullivan and Republican Congressman Nick Begich, both of whom have been very pro-Trump, even as Alaska's other Republican representative in Congress, Senator Lisa Murkowski, has mildly criticized him. But Dan and Nick, hey, stand up. And I just want to say, for whatever reason, it wasn't just the big turnout they got in Anchorage. There were a ton of protests all over Alaska at this time. Gustavus, Alaska, population 600-something. That's a significant portion of the town. There's only 600 people in the town. Soldotna, Alaska, all along the main drag there, people outside the AutoZone. Bethel, Alaska. It was really cold and rainy, but people turned out in Bethel, Alaska. Look at the turnout in Fairbanks, Alaska. Fairbanks had tons of people turn out this weekend. At Nome, Alaska, N-O-M-E, Nome, protesters posted up there again at the marker for the end of the Iditarod sled dog race. You see the sign there, stop disappearing people. A lot of signs along those lines. In protests we saw everywhere all over the country. Kodiak, Alaska, another good turnout there. Lots of American flags. United we stand, divided we fall. Beautiful Kodiak, Alaska. This was Homer, Alaska. Homer Head Start, 32 years. Keep it going. As Trump says, of course, he wants to eliminate the entire Head Start program everywhere in the country. Literally, I mean, was there a single town in Alaska that didn't protest this weekend? I watched local news reports in Alaska. There were protests on Saturday, all simultaneously in Juneau, Seward, Wasilla, Anchorage, Gustavus, Soldotna, Bethel, Fairbanks, Nome, Kodiak, Homer. I might have even missed some. Oh, Petersburg, Alaska as well. Petersburg's super cute. They call it Little Norway. They turned out to protest in Petersburg, Alaska against Trump this weekend. Hey, Elon, Mars beckons. And that's just a snapshot of one state. That's just Alaska. That was kind of on fuego this weekend. But, you know, if you want to generalize, I think, about how the protests against Trump are evolving now that we're 90 whatever days in, I would say that the media is now covering these protests more and more. And I think that's part because there's a lot of them and they're big. I think it's also maybe because the media is realizing that Trump is only getting less and less popular with each passing day in each new poll. This protest movement to the media, I think, seems like a tangible way to see and describe and report on that. In terms of other changes and evolutions in the anti-Trump movement, I would say for this weekend in particular, one other change we saw is that in a lot of places, people added food drives and clothing drives and other really practical efforts to build donations for food pantries and other local resources that have been hit so hard by Trump's cuts. And those food drives happened alongside the marches and rallies, which is really constructive. I would also say in general that we are, if you want a generalized perception of what's going on in terms of how this movement is changing, I would say we're seeing more protests in red states and in Republican areas of blue or purple states. I mean, that's my impression from looking at all the footage that I have looked at from this weekend's events. Here's some more. Here's Amarillo, Texas this weekend. Here's the big turnout they got in Atlanta, Georgia this weekend. Tons of people turned out in Atlanta. Really big turnout in Boise, Idaho. Boise again and again and again has been turning out huge numbers of people in Idaho. Here's Carson City, Nevada. Look how many people turned out in Carson City, including outside the state legislature building there. Carson City, of course, the capital. Thousands of people turned out to protest in Chicago once again. Chicago definitely showing up. Here's Clarksburg, West Virginia. outside the Harrison County Courthouse. Here's Cincinnati on the left side of your screen. Here's Columbus on the right side of your screen. Ohio has been turning out a lot of anti-Trump protests throughout this past 90 days. This weekend was no exception in Ohio. Here's Michigan. Here's Detroit on the left side of your screen and Grand Rapids on the right side of your screen. Michigan, like Ohio, has been turning out lots and lots of Trump protests with big crowds. This was Saturday in Detroit and in Grand Rapids. There was big crowd protesting in Denver this weekend, yet again. Denver, Colorado. Also, Fargo, North Dakota turned up this weekend. People along the main drag there in Fargo. Concord, Massachusetts, they celebrated the 250th anniversary on Saturday of the first battle of the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The anti-tyranny, no kings theme dovetailed very well between the commemoration of the American Revolution and the many people who turned out there to protest against Trump at the same time. Let's do a few more of these. This is left to right, top to bottom. That's Huntersville, North Carolina. Really big, impressive turnout in Los Angeles. Morgantown, West Virginia, where they have been hit very hard by Trump destroying federal offices and agencies. Lower left, that's Mobile, Alabama. Lower center, that's New Haven, Connecticut. And lower right there, that's Raleigh, North Carolina. They had a really big turnout in Raleigh. Look at that crowd. Here's another group. Upper left, that's West Caldwell, New Jersey. Upper center, that's Portland, Maine. On the right, on the top, that's Newton, New Jersey. Lower left, that's Westmont, Illinois. Mesa, Arizona in the center on the bottom there. And beautiful Livingston, Montana on the lower right. We saw big protests this weekend in Greenville, South Carolina, and in Springfield, Ohio, which you will remember. That's where Donald Trump and J.D. Vance attacked Haitian immigrants in perverse terms. Lots of protesters out in San Diego, California. New Orleans, people turned out in the French Quarter to protest. We say no to deportations, protect immigrant rights. Sacramento, California, a big turnout in their Trump protest this weekend. Norwalk, Connecticut. Surprise, Arizona. Topeka, Kansas. Here's just a couple more. Look at the big crowd in Topeka. This was Rock Hill, South Carolina. The Easter Bunny says, hop away from fascism. No more rotten eggs in the White House. Here's a look at St. Paul, Minnesota, where they turned out just a look at this, very, very large crowd of people to protest against Trump this weekend. Again, in St. Paul. They keep doing this. And I could go on and on and on for a very long time with this. The first 50-51 protests, and again, 50-51 stands for 50 protests in 50 states on one day. The first one that they held was in February. It was mostly at state capitals. They actually had more than 50 protests that day, but less than 100. Now, in April, in the same month, we had one day with over 1,000 simultaneous protests, another one this weekend with over 900 simultaneous protests. I mean, some of these protests this week, this month, we've seen tens of thousands of people, a few that topped 100,000 people. Sounds like the next one of these is not going to be on a Saturday. It's going to be on May Day, on Thursday, May 1st. We shall see. But again, I think in general, what we are seeing is that more of the media is figuring out that this is quite a thing. This is not business as usual. This is quite a thing that is happening over and over again at state capitals and on overpasses and on town squares and on street corners and in all sorts of unexpected places, including the reddest of red states. My sense is that as Trump's poll numbers continue to drop, not only are the protests going to grow and spread, but they're going to get more and more attention as well as the dominant news narrative in the country becomes not just what it has been, which is the failures and mistakes and scandals of the administration, the damage Trump is doing. But I think the dominant narrative in the country is becoming not just that disastrous behavior by Trump, but also the country saying no to him and resisting him more and more and more all the time. And that's not just a vibe or a feeling. That is a granular thing that is happening with these protests that we are seeing all over the frickin' country over and over and over again.
In 1932, the unemployment rate in this country was 23.6%. Let me say that again. The unemployment rate in 1932 was 23.6%. We were at the depth of what came to be known as the Great depression, the cruelest economic depression in American history. Starving children were going to bed hungry in this country in 1932. The suicide rate was skyrocketing. And today, the Trump stock market is on its way, according to the Wall Street Journal, to the, quote, worst April since 1932. Prior to the Donald Trump stock market, not a single economic indicator in this country has ever resembled anything in 1932 during the entire course of our lifetimes. But now Donald Trump has managed to bring the stock market back to 1932. The difference between 1932 and today is that in 1932, the only hope, and I mean the only hope, that people had in this country came from the newly elected President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was working every day then to lead the country out of that depression, which is exactly what he did. Every president in our lifetimes has always known every minute of the day how to instantaneously crash the stock market. They've all known how to do it, and not one of them has chosen to do that until Donald Trump. Every president always knew that all he had to do to crash the stock market was to take a public swipe at the chair of the Federal Reserve, who has always been, no matter who it is, more popular with Wall Street than any president of the United States. So for better or worse, Wall Street always respects the Federal Reserve chair much more than they respect the president of the United States. And now that respect gap is bigger than ever. And so Donald Trump decided that once again today, he would publicly attack Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, who was appointed to that job by Donald Trump in his first term, and then was reappointed by President Biden. That's right. President Biden reappointed Republican Jerome Powell, who was originally put into that position by Republican Donald Trump. And so the guy who says he always chooses the best people is now attacking one of his best people and crashing the stock market every single time that he does it. No president has ever been stupid enough to do that until Donald Trump. At 9:41 a.m., Donald Trump decided to go on social media and predict a recession, which no president has ever done. No president has ever predicted a recession during their term. So Donald Trump predicted a recession, and then he blamed it on the Federal Reserve chair, saying there can be a slowing of the economy, otherwise known as a recession, unless Mr. Too Late, a major loser, lowers interest rates, N-O-W, capital letters. Now, all those Trump voters who believed Donald Trump was going to make the American economy better all by himself, all of them thought that he was able to do that, and they never once on the campaign trail heard Donald Trump say he could only make the economy great if the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates. Never mentioned that on the campaign trail, but now Donald Trump says, the only I can fix it guy, I can't fix anything unless the chair of the Federal Reserve fixes it for me. That's what he's saying now. Speculation today then ran wild that Donald Trump would try to fire the chair of the Federal Reserve, which is against the law. CNBC's coverage of the market today once again turned dark.
This is what you get. I mean, somebody needs to turn to the camera and tell the president to stop. I mean, he is messing with the foundation of this country. He's messing with the foundation of the economy. He's messing with America's place in the global financial system.
It is against the law for the president to fire the chair of the Federal Reserve, and Jerome Powell has said under no circumstances would he quit if threatened by Donald Trump with firing. But having seen Donald Trump defy the law in other arenas, the stock market is worried to the point that the Wall Street Journal titled its editorial tonight, "The Fire Jerome Powell Market Rout." The Journal editorial says, markets fear Mr. Trump really might fire Mr. Powell, not that it would do the president any good. He'd have to remove more than the chairman to change the Federal Open Market Committee, which sets interest rates and tries to satisfy the central bank's dual mandate of maximum employment and stable prices. This is a recipe for more market uncertainty. The tariffs will cause at least a one-time increase in the price of tariffed goods, which may become more entrenched if the Fed accommodates them by cutting rates. Markets are spooked because they don't know if Mr. Trump listens to anyone but his own impulses. Everything you're about to hear is something Donald Trump apparently does not know, and it is this. The chairman of the Federal Reserve does not set interest rates. Nope, he doesn't. Interest rates are established by a majority vote of a Federal Reserve Committee of 12 members. The Wall Street Journal notes Mr. Trump can't fire the regional Fed bank presidents on the committee, and all 12 voting members seem to agree with the Fed's recent policy moves. Even if you don't buy a new car during the Trump years, your automobile costs are going up right now tonight. NBC News is reporting, quote, an extended trade war could cause the average annual cost of car insurance to rise more than $300 by the end of the year, according to estimates from the insurance agency Insurify. I bought a Kia 4 years ago because it was the cheapest car in its category, and now it's in the shop waiting for a part to be shipped from South Korea. It's going to be a lot more expensive than it would have been during the Biden presidency. And while I'm driving a rental car during this very long wait, it turns out, for that highly tariffed part to arrive, this is what I'm hearing.
Starting next week, all vehicle prices go up because of the 25% auto tariff. That means if you're thinking about getting a new or pre-owned Nissan, now is the time. Why wait and pay 25% more? Come to Nissan of Van Nuys today and lock in those pre-tariff pricings before it's too late. Once prices go up, they're not coming back down.
You know, car advertising always delivers the simplest messages. And so these ads now presume that every adult in America understands who actually pays tariffs. There's a whole new car advertising genre now about pre-tariff pricing. Lock in those pre-tariff pricings before it's too late. Now is the time. Why wait and pay 25% more? That is not followed by a Trump campaign ad saying, don't worry, China will pay the tariff. You don't have to worry. Don't worry, South Korea will pay the tariff. Japan will pay the tariff. Germany will pay the tariff. Everyone knows now. Everyone knows Donald Trump has been lying every single time he has ever told his voters who pays those tariffs. He always said China pays the tariffs. He always said the foreign countries pays the tariffs. He was lying every time they said it. And now his voters know. Now they know. In April of 1932, when the stock market was falling exactly the way the stock market is falling this April, no one could afford to buy a car in America. No one except the very richest people in America could afford to buy a car in 1932. And so here we are at the Make America 1932 again moment when Donald Trump is turning the stock market into its 1932 performance level right in the middle of the worst depression in our history. That's where we are now. That's where the stock market is, not the economy. Luckily, has not gone to that. But even Donald Trump now is predicting a recession. Donald Trump is making everything in our lives more expensive with his tariffs, as everyone in the country is looking forward to the benefits, for example, of retirement accounts. Every one of them every retirement account now has less money in it than it did when Joe Biden was president. Thanks entirely to Donald Trump. who inherited the strongest economy any president has ever inherited, and all he had to do to continue to claim that the surging Biden stock market was all thanks to him, all he had to do would have been to do absolutely nothing and just stay on a golf course all day, every day, and have nothing to do with government. Everyone in this country would be economically better off if Donald Trump had just done nothing. And so we might be on the verge tonight of the made-for-TV drama that will sink the stock market even below 1932 levels if Donald Trump tries to fire the Federal Reserve chairman against the law, or somehow have Jerome Powell locked out of the Federal Reserve building in Washington, D.C. And all eyes will once again turn to the United States Supreme Court, who would have the last word on a confrontation between the president and the chairman of the Federal Reserve. But no one looks to the United States Supreme Court the way we used to. No one looks to the court with confidence anymore, because Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas are both the most publicly, politically compromised Supreme Court justices in the history of the court, and because Donald Trump and his Justice Department lawyers have done nothing, despite a Supreme Court order, to facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia from a prison in El Salvador after the Supreme Court ordered the Trump administration to facilitate his return because he was forcibly sent there in what the Trump Justice Department initially admitted in court was a mistake. Today, the White House press secretary contradicted the Trump Justice Department's own statements about the case in court when she said today, "We did not make a mistake." It will be interesting to see one of the Trump Justice Department lawyers try to say that in court, in direct contradiction to the previous Trump Justice Department lawyer who told the judge it was a mistake. Before that lawyer then, of course, got fired by the Trump Justice Department. Today, Florida Democratic Congressman Maxwell Frost was one of the members of the House of Representatives who traveled to El Salvador and was denied any opportunity to meet with Mr. Abrego Garcia.
This could happen to any one of our constituents, any one of my constituents in Orlando, Florida, tomorrow or the next day. And so it's important that we draw the line here with Kilmar, that we ensure that he gets taken home, brought back home, where he can go through a process and go through due process.
Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen did succeed in his mission to El Salvador on Thursday when he met with Mr. Abrego Garcia.
Do you think that the country is currently in a constitutional crisis?
Oh, yes, we are. They are very much flouting the courts as we speak. As the courts have said, facilitating his return means something more than doing nothing. And they are doing nothing. Yes, they're absolutely in violation of the court orders as we speak.
I can tell you that when you're working in government and Bob Woodward's number pops up on your phone, which has happened to me, your heart rate picks up a little bit, no matter what administration you're in. And he's going to be here at the table in just a few minutes. But first, I want to show you something he said the last time we spoke, because it was right after the election, just a few weeks after. And one of the things we talked about was the glaring incompetence of the people Donald Trump was picking for his cabinet. People like Pete Hegseth.
I have known over the reporting time I've had for 5 decades, 16 secretaries of defense, going back even before I was reporter Robert McNamara. And they have to know management. They have to know what the responsibility is. They have to know where the levers of power are. And in this appointee, I see none of that.
16 secretaries of defense. I see none of that, is what he said. And yet it didn't take an investigative mind like Bob Woodward's to know that Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense might be slightly problematic. I mean, before running the U.S. military, he was a weekend morning show host on Fox News with a reputation for going years without washing his hands, which, by the way, is his admission, just to make it even weirder. And no shade to cable news hosts, obviously, even ones who get a little crazy on New Year's Eve, you can see there. It's not a job that exactly prepares you to run the Pentagon as your next step. There were also the countless allegations of Hegseth drinking on the job, both at veterans organizations and at Fox News. The New Yorker reported he once got so drunk that he had to be restrained from getting on a stage at a Louisiana strip club. There were the allegations that he ran those relatively small veterans organizations into the ground financially. And of course, there were the allegations about his abuse of women, including his second wife. He denied all of it, of course, but yeah, it's safe to say there were some signs that maybe this guy wasn't exactly fit for the job of overseeing the Defense Department. And so when we saw this headline at the end of March, it was one of those things that was both shocking but kind of unsurprising. And the very first paragraph of Jeffrey Goldberg's story was, again, both shocking but entirely unsurprising in a lot of ways. I mean, here's what it said, quote, "The world found out shortly before 2 p.m. Eastern time on March 15th that the United States was bombing Houthi targets across Yemen. I, however, knew 2 hours before the first bombs exploded that the attack might be coming. The reason I knew this is that Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, had texted me the war plan at 11:44 a.m. The plan included precise information about weapons, packages, targets, and timing. Well, a few hours after that story was published, Jeffrey Goldberg was here at this table, and we watched together as Pete Hegseth looked straight into the camera and lied about what Jeffrey Goldberg knew to be true."
You're talking about a deceitful and highly discredited so-called journalist who's made a profession of peddling hoaxes time and time again. Nobody was texting war plans, and that's all I have to say about that.
I'm going to be responsible here and not disclose the things that I read and saw. I will describe them to you. The specific time of a future attack, specific targets, including human targets, meant to be killed in that attack, weapon systems, even weather reports.
Now, as you know, eventually Goldberg did release the screenshots of what Hegseth texted him, laying out in explicit detail the weaponry and sequencing involved with that attack. And even after those screenshots were released, Hegseth kept on lying.
I noticed this morning out came something that doesn't look like war plans. And as a matter of fact, they even changed the title to attack plans because they know it's not war plans. There's no units, no locations, no routes, no flight paths, no sources, no methods, no classified information.
I mean, I've watched that clip a lot of times. It's almost like the louder he talks, the more believable he thinks it will be, I guess. I don't know. But even though we knew he was lying, even though we knew he had texted war plans to a reporter or attack plans, whatever you want to call them, he kept his job. Trump defended him. Republicans in Congress didn't do a whole lot. And despite the fact that there were obviously other signal chats with classified information on them, that story kind of faded into the background, in part because Donald Trump decided to tank the global economy and also ship people to foreign prisons without any charges. My point is, there were a lot of pressing stories to cover. But over the past few days, we started to get this sense that something else might be coming out of Pete Hegseth's Pentagon. Because on Friday, top officials of the Pentagon started getting fired. And they started getting fired for, wait for it, this is almost my favorite detail, leaking. And believe me, the irony is only going to get richer as we keep telling this story. 3 Pentagon officials close to Hegseth, his former senior advisor, Dan Caldwell, former Deputy Chief of Staff, Jaron Selnick, and the Deputy Defense Secretary's Chief of Staff, Colin Carroll, confirmed they were placed on administrative leave. On Friday, we also learned that Joe Casper, Hegseth's own Chief of Staff, would be transferring to a different role in the Pentagon. And John Elliott, another senior Pentagon official, also said he resigned last week, although the Pentagon said they asked him to resign. So lots of firings, a bunch of resignations, apparently about leaks. So yeah, it kind of felt like something was coming. Well, lo and behold, late yesterday afternoon, the New York Times dropped a bombshell report about another signal chat. The Times writes, quote, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth shared detailed information about forthcoming strikes in Yemen on March 15th in a private signal group chat that included his wife, brother, and personal lawyer. Some of those people said that the information Hegseth shared on the Signal chat included the flight schedules for the F-A-18 Hornets targeting the Houthis in Yemen. Essentially the same attack plans that he shared on a separate Signal chat the same day that mistakenly included the editor of The Atlantic. Now, Hegseth's brother Phil does work at the Pentagon, although he is not anywhere near a role that directly involves military operations, and for good reason. As the AP reports, based on Phil Hegseth's publicly available resume, his past experience includes founding his own podcast production company and working on social media and podcasts at the Hudson Institute. That said, Phil the podcaster might have some kind of security clearance. We really don't know. As for Hegseth's wife, well, she has already been kind of a point of contention. You see, Jennifer Hegseth does not actually work for the Department of Defense. And yet we know that she has been sitting in on sensitive meetings. As the Wall Street Journal reported just last month, quote, one of the meetings, a high-level discussion, took place at a sensitive moment for the transatlantic alliance, one day after the U.S. said it had cut off military intelligence sharing with Ukraine. The group discussed the U.S. rationale behind that decision. The Pentagon has been asked in the past about whether Jennifer, a former Fox News producer, has a security clearance. I don't know why she would, but who knows? They have declined to answer the question, which is quite telling on its own. But here's the thing. Even if both Jennifer the wife and Phil the podcaster do have security clearances, there's no reason for the defense secretary to be texting them attack plans and details about a military operation. Because typically the people who have access to this type of information are categorized as need to know. And if you're in the need to know group, it means it's essential that you have the details of the operation or classified information in order to do your jobs. Meaning just because you have a certain level of security clearance, it doesn't mean you have access to every piece of information that is in that level of security clearance. It's if you really need to know it. Generally, that group does not include a liaison officer like Phil Hegseth, and it certainly does not include the secretary's spouse. So that story broke yesterday, and then Secretary Hegseth's day got, I would say, even worse. As I mentioned just a moment ago, his former aide, a guy by the name of John Elliott, one of the staffers who quit, published an op-ed in Politico, describing his month from hell, as he describes it, working for Hegseth. Elliott writes that, quote, it's hard to see Hegseth remaining in his role for much longer, adding, quote, the last month has been a full-blown meltdown at the Pentagon, and it's becoming a real problem for the administration. Elliott also hinted at the secretary's week getting even worse, saying, quote, and this is quite a thing to write in an op-ed, there are very likely more shoes to drop in short order, with even bigger bombshell stories coming this week. Key Pentagon reporters have been telling sources privately. Who knows what will come? We'll see. But a former senior aide is predicting that. Now, just for some context, John Elliott is not at all some sort of undercover resistance crusader. He's the former Pentagon spokesperson, best known for a statement to ESPN defending the Pentagon's decision to wipe references to baseball legend Jackie Robinson's military service by saying, quote, DEI is dead at the Defense Department. It's that guy. He's also the one who took the lead in kicking a number of prominent media outlets, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN, out of their Pentagon workspaces. I mean, he's a dyed-in-the-wool MAGA guy. He probably still has his hat in his closet. Maybe he's wearing it on the weekend. I don't know. He's been with Donald Trump since the 2016 campaign. And he actually spends much of that op-ed, I quoted, lavishing praise on Trump's warped view of national security. But he draws the line at Pete Hegseth. And now at least one Republican congressman seems to share his view, saying out loud for the first time that Hegseth must go. And yet, all day long, the White House did what it always does, right before Donald Trump unceremoniously fires someone on social media. We see there's like a pattern here. They close ranks around the guy. The press secretary even took the time to deny a report that Hegseth was about to be fired. And they all just, of course, blame the media for reporting on what people inside the Pentagon told them.
This is what the media does. They take anonymous sources from disgruntled former employees, and then they try to slash and burn people and ruin their reputations.
It's just fake news. They just bring up stories. I guess it sounds like disgruntled employees.
This is what happens when the entire Pentagon is working against you and working against the monumental change that you are trying to implement.
The trumpet in that first few parts is quite something in the background. But that aside, I mean, the Pentagon is working against Pete Hegseth, like the entire Pentagon as an institution. Did the entire Pentagon as an institution type a signal text chain on the Secretary of Defense's personal phone that included detailed military operations and then force him to include his wife and brother? Because that would be quite a story. That would be a huge story. Of course, that's not what happened. And these are the same non-denial denials that Trump world always churns out when they know that a reporter has caught them red-handed, doing something they're not supposed to do. Sadly, we're kind of used to this by now. Seems like every day this administration is scrambling to clean up one mess or another mess. Because when it comes to staffing the government, Donald Trump isn't sending his best.
Let's say the president gets his wish and replaces Jay Powell. Not just who is he going to, not the name of who's he going to put in that seat, but what can that new Fed chair do to get us out of this vortex that we're in?
Well, unless he makes a Faustian bargain with the president to lower interest rates and potentially soften the blow from any impending recession, or he could exacerbate inflationary pressures that come from the tariffs that are currently in place. We don't know. It's hard to say what any Fed chair could do. By the way, he's not the only voter on the policy setting committee of the Federal Reserve. There are many others who voice their opinions and offer their votes, one of whom could be Jerome Powell, whose position as chair may expire in 2026, but he remains a governor until 2028. He could stay on for another 2 years on the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve. So he would still have a say, small say to be exact, 1/12 of the decision-making process. But I don't know what a Fed chair would do if indeed the president replaced Jay Powell, which is currently illegal. But if he tried, what we do know is there'd be even more market chaos than we have now.
Tyler, can we go back to the trifecta I mentioned? Stocks, bonds, and the dollar all dropping. This clear sign that global investors are saying we don't feel great about America right now. When do we get to a point where this reality breaks through to this White House? What is happening inside the White House with Trump and his team as they're looking at these numbers every day?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big focus for the Trump team right now is trying to make trade deals with some of these countries during this 90-day pause. One of the things that I think is important to note is that these trade deals are usually the work of months, if not years, of delicate negotiations. Trade deals, Stephanie, as you know, are very complex and require a lot of hashing out the details. And that is not what Trump is allowing for with this 90-day pause. There's a rush of activity to try to get these deals done. And some experts and analysts say it's likely maybe one or two of them with close allies, maybe Japan and South Korea, could get done in that time frame, but that's unlikely to change the global economic picture. And so I think one of the things that we have to watch for is the Trump administration, the president and his allies have said that Americans may need to deal with some short-term pain for long-term gain, that they are right-sizing the global economic market and ensuring that Americans are getting a fair trade deal with partners. The question is, how long is that bargain? And one of the larger things looming over all of this is this idea that Trump has put forth that they are going to restart a manufacturing boom in the United States. That is not something that can happen overnight. And so if that's the sort of time frame or horizon that we're looking on, Americans are going to be under some pressure when it comes to prices for quite some time.
20 years and about a few $1 trillion. I want to share a bit of what our colleague Steve Liesman said earlier about how the economy is tied to pretty much most of what Trump is doing these days. Watch this.
Let me see if I can connect this to the things that you report on all day long, which is not necessarily the financial markets, but what's going on with the Supreme Court, what's going on with the legal firms, what's going on with Harvard and these others. There are things that the president has done that nobody ever thought a president would do. And that's why in financial markets, you cannot dismiss some probability that the president will fire the Fed chair. People say, oh, it's not going to happen. I said, well, we thought he was going to follow the Supreme Court. We thought he was not going to necessarily withhold X billions of dollars from Harvard. So it's all of the same piece in that you cannot relax and you cannot bet on a team where the captain is hitting the ball into his own net.
Susan, what is your reaction? I mean, you know this. For the last 8 years, big Trump supporters have said, oh, that's just his bluster. He's not going to do it. But here we have it. He's doing it.
Yeah, I think it's right to connect the dots between the assault on, many different independent institutions, which is a theme that has run through the not quite 100 days of this second Trump term. And I would point out that as far as Chairman Powell goes, you noted that he was appointed by Donald Trump in his first term. Donald Trump also repeatedly threatened to fire Powell in his first term. In fact, we did reporting for our book, The Divider, and it was clear that some senior officials at the Fed literally could not go to sleep for months worrying about the next day being the day that there would be a constitutional crisis, an impasse between the independent Federal Reserve and the White House. It didn't come to pass in part because it was a very different regime at that time, and Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, essentially spent almost full time managing Trump to avoid that kind of catastrophe. By the way, Powell was prepared to spend, quote, every last nickel of his own money, and he has millions and millions of dollars, in order to go to court to stop Donald Trump from eroding the independence of the American Central Bank, which many Wall Street investors, of course, believe is one of the pillars of our economy. So if Trump takes the next step, I would expect Powell to consider very seriously suing him. I would expect there to be a major crisis that obviously will add further instability into our markets and a level of uncertainty at the core of the American financial system that I think is unlike anything we've ever seen. If there is that kind of outright confrontation between the chairman of the Federal Reserve and the president of the United States.
David, almost everything Susan just laid out, I've heard from Wall Street investors and bankers over the last 5 days. The last thing they want to see is Jay Powell fired, even if they're not big supporters of him, and the Fed losing their independence. Very few of them are speaking publicly, despite their panic. What does that tell you about the fear they have or the concern they have about speaking publicly? Because none of these people, none of these big investors are shy when it comes to press time.
Yeah, well, that's because they've paid attention the last decade or so, and they've seen how Donald Trump lashes out at critics. They have businesses to run, they have investment funds to manage, and they cannot afford to be on the receiving end of a president who is willing to stretch the bounds of executive power. And look, people might be surprised based on what they thought they would get from Trump, but based on what they got from Trump the first term. But they shouldn't be. Trump always enjoys chaos. He is comfortable in it, especially when he's at the center of it and all of the chaos revolves around him. And so I think you can expect, particularly because tariffs are the one thing that he is an ideologue on, that he will keep pushing this and try and get other aspects of government to sort of open a relief valve, if you will, to make the impact of the tariffs and his indecision easier for the economy to stomach. I think the question is whether or not the Treasury Secretary Bessent and Lutnick on occasion can get through to him to have him sort of soften the edges of what he's doing. They were able to do it somewhat with the 90-day pause. The 90 days is going to run out. What is going to happen then?
Ron, you wrote today about what it would do to America's global reputation if the president replaces the Fed chair. I want you to lay it out for us.
Well, it's like any other kind of chaotic event, except orders of magnitude larger. Because if you take an independent...
Pure chaos, but way worse.
But way worse, yeah. I mean, no, from what we've experienced now, tariffs, you can argue, all day long about whether they're worthwhile or not, even though they're slowing the economy and affecting consumers or will affect consumers sometime soon. An independent Federal Reserve, or broadly speaking, an independent central bank is the gold standard of modern economics. And if you were to remove by force, for political reasons alone, the independence and threaten the independence of the Federal Reserve and have ultimately the president, to a certain extent, being the decider in chief on interest rate policy. You've now moved the Fed from being an independent economic regulator, if you will, to one that's politically motivated. And that would be disastrous. And you'd see most likely a run on the dollar, large sales of Treasury bonds, so interest rates would go up and the stock market would go down. Everyone who talks about this and everyone who discusses it, including Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee, says just look at the countries that do not have independent central banks and see how their currencies perform, see how their economies perform. He would pay a large price for making a move like that.